Chapter 6. The Escape to the Wasteland. Zeke and Kyris slipped through a hole in the wall, the jagged edges of rusted metal scraping against their clothes as they made their way through. The cold night air bit at their skin, and Zeke's heart pounded as they stepped into the darkness beyond the city's boundary. They were officially outside Static City. Just as they were about to move forward, Kyris suddenly grabbed Zeke's arm, her fingers tightening as she pulled him down behind a pile of debris. "Drone," she whispered urgently, her eyes scanning the sky. Zeke followed her gaze, barely catching a glimpse of a patrolling drone as it passed overhead, its red light sweeping the area. They stayed still, holding their breath until the drone moved away, the whirring sound fading into the distance. Once it was safe, Kyris released Zeke's arm and nodded. "Come on, let's go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They moved cautiously, slipping out from behind the debris and setting off across the wasteland on foot. The landscape was barren, a desolate stretch of broken-down pieces of tech, rusted-out cars, and crumbling remnants of a world long forgotten. The only light came from the stars above and the faint glow of Static City in the distance behind them. They walked for hours, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Zeke kept his eyes on the horizon, every step taking them further from the only home he had ever known. Eventually, they found a relatively sheltered spot beneath the remains of an old highway overpass, the concrete structure still standing strong despite the years of decay. "This will do," Kyris said, dropping her bag to the ground and rummaging through it for their rations. They sat together, sharing what little food they had: protein bars, dried fruits, and water. As they ate, Zeke looked around at the empty landscape, a strange sense of calm settling over him. "It's so quiet out here," he said softly, almost to himself. "No city noise, no ads blaring in my head, just silence." Kyris glanced at him, her expression softening. "Yeah, it's different. Feels like we're actually free for once." Zeke nodded, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. The quiet was unnerving, but it was also a relief. For the first time in his life, he wasn't surrounded by the constant hum of the city, the barrage of ads, the oppressive surveillance. It was just him, Kyris, and the vast unknown ahead. The next morning they set off again, the sun rising over the wasteland and casting long shadows across the debris. As they walked, they stumbled upon an old car, half buried in the dirt. It was rusted and covered in grime, but Kyris approached it, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Think we can get it working?" she asked, glancing back at Zeke. Zeke shrugged, stepping closer to inspect it. Only one way to find out. He knelt down, prying open the hood and examining the engine. It was ancient, but with some tinkering and a bit of luck, he thought they might be able to hotwire it. Kyris handed him a few tools from her bag, and together they worked on the car, their hands moving with practiced precision. After a while, Zeke twisted a couple of wires together, and the engine sputtered to life, coughing out a cloud of black smoke before settling into a low rumble. Kyris grinned, clapping Zeke on the back. "Nice work, genius. Now let's get out of here." They climbed into the car, Zeke taking the driver's seat and Kyris beside him. The vehicle lurched forward, the wheels struggling to grip the uneven ground before finally gaining traction. They drove for hours, the wasteland stretching out endlessly before them. The road was rough, and the car rattled with every bump, but the further they went, the more they felt like they were leaving the past behind. As they drove, they talked about the city, about their pasts, about what they hoped to find beyond the wasteland. Kyris told Zeke about her childhood, how she'd grown up scavenging and learning to fix things just to survive. Zeke shared stories of his own, how even as a kid he had a knack for taking things apart just to see how they worked. He would spend hours dismantling old radios, broken drones, anything he could find, fascinated by the flow of electricity through circuit boards and the intricacies of mechanical parts. It was how he learned to understand tech, piece by piece, and it became his way of surviving in Static City. He told Kyris about the things he'd done to get by, the odd jobs fixing tech for neighbors, hacking into systems for extra credits, and the way he'd always felt like he was just a cog in a machine that didn't care whether he lived or died. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness around them grew thick. an oppressive blackness that made Zeke and Kyris uneasy. They had never experienced this kind of pitch dark before. The city had always been lit by neon and screens. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, but when the engine began to sputter and eventually died, they were left in silence, the oppressive night surrounding them. They had no choice but to continue on foot. As they walked, Zeke looked up, seeing the stars for the first time in his life, countless pinpricks of light scattered across the sky. It was beautiful, but also strange and unsettling, a reminder of how far they were from the world they knew. It was then that they saw it, a city in the distance, unlike anything they'd ever seen before. It wasn't like Static City, with its neon lights and towering skyscrapers. This place looked almost old-fashioned, with metal pipes and steam billowing from chimneys, gears, and cogs visible on the buildings. It was like something out of a storybook, a steampunk wonderland that seemed to defy time. Kyris leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the city. "That's Steam Haven," she said. "I've heard about this place. They rejected modern technology, kind of like how the Amish rejected electricity. They rely on steam power, old machinery. It's a different kind of life." Zeke stared, fascinated. "Why would they do that?" Kyris shrugged. "They didn't want to be controlled by tech. They saw what happened to places like Static City, how everything got twisted by corporations and surveillance. So they chose a different path." As they approached the city, it became clear that they were outsiders. People on the streets stopped what they were doing to stare, their eyes wide as they took in Zeke and Kyris' clothes, their tech, the chrome visible on Zeke's arm. Whispers followed them, and Zeke could feel the weight of their gazes, the judgment, the fear. "Feels like we're in a freak show," Zeke muttered under his breath. Kyris smirked. "Well, we are pretty freaky compared to them. Just stay cool. We're just here for supplies." They walked through the streets, trying to find someone who would help them. But every time they approached, people turned away, shaking their heads or simply ignoring them. It was frustrating, and Zeke could feel his patience wearing thin. He couldn't help but think how much easier this would be if they had the tech to solve the problem. Drones could have scanned for a fuel source, or even a simple map app could have directed them to a place with gas. Instead, they were stumbling around, relying on word of mouth in a world that seemed determined to make things as difficult as possible. Finally, they reached the Boiler and Blazer, a brain dance unlike anything Zeke had ever seen. The shop was filled with bombs made from pipes, tubes, and gears, intricately crafted pieces that looked like they were plucked straight out of a history. The shelves were lined with jars of herbs, strange glass contraptions, and mechanical devices whose purpose Zeke could only guess. The air smelled sweet, with a hint of burnt oil, and a soft clinking sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the store. Behind the counter stood an Asian man in his mid-30s. As soon as Zeke and Kyris walked in, he jumped up, his eyes widening. "Whoa, this is some strong hemp, or I'm seeing some techies in my store," he said, blinking at them. Zeke and Kyris exchanged glances before stepping forward. "Hey, I'm Zeke, and this is Kyris," Zeke said. The man nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Name Slippy? Hello, I guess? So what can I do for you?" Kyris spoke up. "We need gas or some other way of getting out of here." Slippy raised an eyebrow, his expression becoming even more dazed. This is a bong shop, dude. Who told you that we had gas?" Zeke sighed, glancing at Kyris before answering. It was an old man down the street. Slippy suddenly laughed wildly, shaking his head. "Frank? That man thinks he can ride a steam-powered unicycle across the wasteland. Heh, he's always messing with people." He leaned across the counter, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Well, since I got you here, how about we have a little smoke?" Zeke shook his head. "Sorry, I don't vape." Slippy laughed even louder. "What is a vape? Never mind, come with me." He waved them along as he walked to a staircase at the back of the shop. Zeke and Kyris exchanged another glance before following Slippy upstairs. The room they entered was filled with smoke, a haze hanging in the air, and a group of people sitting in a circle, their faces relaxed and serene. The scent of herbs was stronger here, mixing with the scent of burnt oil that seemed to linger everywhere. Slippy gestured for them to join the group. "Welcome to the Boiler Lounge, my friends. Relax, Take a load off. Zeke sat down next to an Asian girl in her mid-20s, and he couldn't help but notice how attractive she was. Her dark hair framed her face perfectly, and her eyes seemed to sparkle in the dim, smoky light. Zeke opened his mouth to say something, but his words stumbled out awkwardly. I'm Zeke, he managed, feeling his face flush slightly. Kyris, sitting nearby, burst out laughing. Hey, don't make it so obvious, Zeke, she teased. The girl smiled warmly, clearly amused by Zeke's awkwardness. I'm Tai, she said, her voice soft and friendly. Zeke tried to regain his composure and asked, Are you from the Pacific Rim? Tai shook her head, her smile never fading. No, I was born and raised right here in Steamhaven. As they spoke, the cigarette was passed around the circle, eventually making its way to Tai. She looked at it briefly before passing it to Zeke. He glanced at her, curious. You don't smoke? Tai shook her head. No, but I like the smell of it, she replied. Zeke nodded, taking the cigarette and bringing it to his lips. He took a puff, the harsh smoke filling his lungs. Almost instantly he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, his body relaxing as he leaned back. It was as if he had been plugged into a brain dance, the world around him warping and shifting in response to the sensation. The room seemed to sway, colors melting together, and Zeke felt himself sinking into the experience. As he leaned back, he found himself brushing against Tai, their shoulders touching, and she looked over at him with a soft smile. Zeke smiled back, feeling an unexpected connection between them, something gentle and reassuring amidst the haze. He could feel the weight of everything. Static City, the wasteland, the uncertainty, start to fade away, replaced by a deep, surreal calm. His mind drifted, the haze of the smoke wrapping around his thoughts, making everything feel distant, like he was floating outside of himself, strangely peaceful. Zeke reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the small chip that had caused so much trouble. He pulled it out, staring at it as the smoke continued to cloud his mind. The strange glint of the chip caught Slippy's eye. Almost immediately, Slippy's relaxed demeanor shifted. His eyes widened in alarm, and he moved quickly, grabbing Zeke by the arm and yanking him up. Whoa, dude, you gotta get out of here with that, Slippy hissed, pulling Zeke away from the circle and into another room. Away from the others, Zeke blinked, disoriented. What's the problem? Slippy glanced nervously around before leaning in, his voice low and urgent. That chip you've got, it's contraband. You get 30 years in jail for any tech like that on you. I'm already on probation for dabbling in some low-tech stuff. If anyone sees that, we're both screwed. Zeke's heart pounded, the high fading slightly as fear crept in. He shoved the chip back into his pocket, his mind racing. I didn't know. I thought it was just old tech. Slippy shook his head, his expression serious. Doesn't matter, man. You need to get that out of my store now. You can't stay here with that thing.